Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW's Fall Brawl 1997. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Jericho, with Jericho hitting a lion salt on Guerrero. Eddie was trying to keep the pace of the match, but Jericho hits a powerbomb on Guerrero. They looked absolutely brutal in the middle of the ring. Guerrero, though, ultimately hits his signature frog splash off the top rope on Jericho, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match and new WCW Cruiserweight Champion is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Harlem Heat versus the Steiners. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Harlem Heat and the Steiners, with the Harlem Heat keeping the pace of the match. But the Steiners ultimately hit the finish on Harlem Heat, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are the Steiner brothers. Hats off to the Steiner brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Ultimo Dragon versus Alex Wright. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between the Dragon and Wright, with the Dragon keeping the pace of the match. Dragon hits a Frankensteiner off the top rope on Wright, but Wright ultimately hits his signature German suplex on the Ultimo Dragon, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Alex Wright. Hats off to Alex Wright for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Dean Malenko. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Jarrett and Malenko, with Malenko keeping the pace of the match. Malenko quickly applies a Texas Cloverleaf on Jarrett, but Jarrett breaks the hold. Jarrett then ultimately applies his signature figure 4 leg lock on Malenko. Malenko ends up tapping out, and your winner of the match by submission is Jeff Jarrett. Hats off to Jeff Jarrett for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Faces of Fear versus Wrath and Mortis. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Faces of Fear and Wrath and Mortis, with the Faces of Fear keeping the pace of the match. But Wrath ultimately hits the finish on the Faces of Fear, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Wrath and Mortis. Hats off to Wrath and Mortis for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Giant versus Scott Norton. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Giant and Norton, with Norton keeping the pace of the match. But Giant ultimately hits the choke slam on Scott Norton, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is the Giant. Hats off to the Giant for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lex Luger teaming up with Diamond Dallas Page versus Randy Savage and Scott Hall. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Lex Luger and DDP keeping the pace of the match. Hall then hits a follow-away slam on DDP. Zbyszko then pushes Scott Hall. Lex then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Lex Luger and Diamond Dallas Page. Hats off to Lex Luger and Diamond Dallas Page for getting a win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Fall Brawl 1997. It is the War Games matchup. It is Ric Flair teaming up with Chris Benoit, Steve McMichael, and Kurt Hennig versus Kevin Nash, Buff Bagwell, Conan, and Syxx. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Horsemen keeping the pace of the match. But Hennig ultimately turns his back on the 4 Horsemen and up attacking the 4 Horsemen, helping Nash, Bagwell, Conan, and Syxx. And your winners of the match are the NWO. Couple things I'm going to say about Fall Brawl 1997 before I get out of here, man. Number one, this was a solid event. Always a big fan of the War Games matches. Those matches are still going on to this day. NXT right now has been using these matches as of late. I think the War Games matches are absolutely awesome. Team versus team. Big fan of the War Games matchup. But as far as Fall Brawl 1997, a couple matches on here that I actually did like and enjoy. And you guys know by now, I was a big fan of the Cruiserweights. Eddie Guerrero versus Chris Jericho to open up Fall Brawl 1997. A solid match from top to bottom. Harlem Heat versus the Steiners, again, solid matchup. Two of the best tag teams of all time, especially in WCW. Ultimo Dragon versus Alex Wright, again, solid matchup. I feel like Ultimo Dragon and Alex Wright really didn't get a fair shake in professional wrestling, in my opinion. Ultimo Dragon has held multiple world championships, whether it's the J Crown Championship, championships over in Mexico, Japan. He's one of the best, and he's definitely one of the legends in professional wrestling, in my honest opinion. Alex Wright, I can honestly say the same thing. I would watch more Alex Wright matches over Disco Inferno, in my honest opinion. I feel like Alex Wright had a lot of potential in WCW. Obviously, he was a rookie when he got with WCW, but he had the moveset. Obviously, there was a lot more for him to learn in the ring, but for what it's worth, I think him going toe-to-toe with Ultimo Dragon and showing his skill set to what he had against a guy like Ultimo Dragon, fantastic matchup, and I think Alex Wright was kind of underrated, in my honest opinion, especially his WCW days. Jeff Jarrett versus Dean Malenko, again, was a solid matchup. Big fan of Dean Malenko, one of the most underrated cruiserweights of all time. Absolute legend. It was a solid matchup between Jarrett and Malenko. Faces of Fear versus Wrath and Mortis. Faces of Fear were a dominant tag team, man. I mean, having Ming and Barbarian teaming up as a tag team, forced to be reckoned with, man. And for what it's worth, I mean, Ming and Barbarian could have easily have been multi-time tag team champions for WCW or any company for that matter. Wrath and Mortis, I'm not a big fan of Wrath, to be honest with you. I was a huge fan of Mortis, or Chris Kanyon, rest in peace to Kanyon. But I think, and I said this multiple times in the past as well, I think Canyon's best character, the only character that he had was Mortis. But I think Mortis, and the character that they were developing for Kanyon in WCW, there was a whole hell of a lot more they could have done with the Mortis character in WCW, in my honest opinion. Am I a huge fan of the Mortis character? Absolutely. I mean, Kanyon, to me, is severely underrated as far as a professional wrestler standpoint is. I think he had the skills, the tangibles to be, a world champion, in my honest opinion. But I was a huge fan of the Mortis character. I just wish WCW did more with the character than what they did, because more times than not, it was Mortis going up against Glacier or Glacier going up against Mortis. And I felt like they could have, really took, pride in what they had with Mortis and really took the time to kind of develop Mortis into the great character that it could have been. But for what it's worth, I think the Mortis character was severely underrated for WCW. But that was a solid matchup as well. Lex Luger teaming up with DDP versus Randy Savage and Scott Hall. Solid matchup. Big fan of Diamond Dallas Page in the days of WCW. And obviously the main event. Fall Brawl 1997 was all about the main event. Basically, it was the Four Horsemen versus the NWO. There was a lot of build-up about this match leading up to the main event. It was a solid matchup. Kurt Hennig turning his back on the Four Horsemen to join the NWO. I'm sure at that time nobody saw that coming. And again, Kurt Hennig's an absolute legend. He's definitely one of those guys that I had no problem with him being in the NWO. There were some guys that were in the NWO before Kurt Hennig that I honestly could have done without. Bagwell was one of them. I think NWO really saved Bagwell's in-ring career, if you ask me. I put him there with Disco Inferno, to be honest with you. But for what it's worth, man, it was a solid event. It really was. I'm not going to sit here and say it was the best WCW event I've ever seen, but it damn sure was not the worst. And just like you guys know by now, every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give Fall Brawl 1997 a solid 6 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Fall Brawl 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.